Details of the raids are coming in, but we do know that the Dutch Foreign Office and the Italian government have both said that the bombing has started, and we know that earlier fighter planes took off from a base in Italy, and they included stealth fighter bombers. And we do know that NATO headquarters in Brussels has been on a state of high alert, and tension has been increasing there. Clarence Mitchell is with me now. Clarence, it's now pretty certain, is it not, that the raids have started?
It certainly looks that way, Martyn. Yes, all the indications in the last hour and a half to 2 hours have been that the NATO planes and shipping have been in position, getting into position. In fact, they've been doing that through the day. We first knew of that with the first B-52 departures from RAF Fairford in Gloucestershire this morning. Clearly there were also reports that US ships had moved into areas of the Adriatic. It was the final positioning of the military pieces ahead of what appeared to be imminent attacks, and as you've said, that confirmation that attacks are now underway suggests that yes, this is the beginning.
Clarence, thanks very much, and we're going over now to David Shukman, who is at the EU summit in Berlin, where the Prime Minister is poised to speak. What is the Prime Minister going to say, David?
Well, we can expect Tony Blair to come out with an endorsement of this action. We expect him to confirm it's underway, and indeed to explain why it's taking place. Just ahead of him, a few minutes ago, the French President Jacques Chirac went on national television, speaking from here at the summit in Berlin. He justified why the action was taking place and why indeed the French were taking part in it. He talked about how the crisis in Kosovo threatened the stability of the entire Balkans region, and how the Serbs' behavior towards the majority Albanian population in Kosovo had quite simply been unacceptable over a period of several months. So leaders here preparing their publics for what is going on this evening, indeed preparing the whole summit here to devote itself now to the whole question of how to handle this crisis and to look beyond.
And David, what we are talking about now is a coordinated response by all the countries' leaders at the EU summit. They in fact have said this was the time that the raids were going to start, and we want to be almost the first people to break the news to our people and explain to them what is happening.
Well, that's right. One of the great priorities here has been to show a united stand, because over the months of this Kosovo crisis, there have been occasions when some European Union member states have been very unwilling to support any idea of military action. The French, for example, at one stage were numbered amongst those. Today, though, the leaders here were adamant that they could show, and in fact have shown, that for the moment at least, they are united on the need for action. I think the test will be over the next few days as this campaign, which is apparently underway already, as it rolls on, whether one or two countries within the EU, within NATO perhaps, might start to question whether things are going too long and are being too vigorous and aggressive in Serbia. But we'll have to wait and see about that.
David, thanks very much indeed. And the NATO Secretary General, Javier Solana, has just confirmed that the airstrikes have taken place. And we have some pictures now of the planes taking off from the Aviano air base in northeast Italy. They included fighters, fighter bombers. In fact, stealth fighter bombers were also seen joining these planes taking off. Clarence Mitchell is still with us. Clarence, confirmation now from NATO. What are the next steps that we can expect? And do we in fact know that it was the cruise missiles from the B-52s which would have spearheaded the attack, or could in fact those planes we just saw taking off from the Italian airbase have been in there first?
It is too early to say yet to know exactly what is happening, but if previous attacks of this nature are anything to go by, I think it's a fair assumption to make that the cruise missiles have been launched both from the B-52 bombers and also from the NATO warships in the Adriatic. A British submarine is also part of that force. Those cruise missiles will have been in the first instance targeted against the Yugoslav defense systems, the air defense systems that the Serbian forces would have, and we know that they have quite a sophisticated system at their control. The idea would be to destroy that as quickly as possible, to make it difficult for the Serbs to defend themselves against further attacks. Manned flights, as we've seen, are now taking place. There was some speculation that they may not take place initially, but they clearly will be backing up the missile attacks. Just to let you know that correspondents in Pristina, the Kosovan capital, are now reporting hearing loud explosions and automatic gunfire.
Right, so the Serb forces in Kosovo are being targeted, and the NATO Secretary-General, Javier Solana, has, as we just said, confirmed that the raids have started. John Pienaar is at Westminster now. John, what's the reaction from Westminster?
Well, we're waiting now, Martyn, for a statement fairly imminently from the Secretary of State for Defence, George Robertson. No doubt he'll be echoing the kind of things we're expecting the Prime Minister Tony Blair to be saying in Berlin, namely reporting that the air attacks have now started, giving again a statement underlining the reasoning, the political reasoning and the justification for those attacks, and then gathering here at Westminster the political reaction from the opposition parties. And where that's concerned, it's pretty clear there'll be a united comment from both Conservatives and Liberal Democrats in support of what is going on. It's almost an unwritten rule of politics that when British forces are in action, it's the job of the politicians to fall in behind them. I imagine that when that statement starts and the questioning begins afterwards, there'll also be some discussion of the longer-term political objectives.
John, you talk about a united response, and surely this united response may not hold if the bombing raids go on and on without any visible response, without any visible diplomatic solution in sight. How is it seen as Westminster? What's the end game as it is seen at Westminster?
Well, there's always the danger that as a military conflict develops, as and when things may perhaps go wrong, then of course that calls into question the solidity of the political backing for that attack. At the outset, I don't doubt for a moment we'll see Paddy, Ashdown and William Hague and other leading figures giving their backing to what's going on, that is, supporting these initial air attacks with the stated objectives that we've been hearing from the Prime Minister, from ministers, and just a short while ago from Joe Lockhart on behalf of the President of the United States. And he was making it quite clear that they were thinking at this stage in the immediate term of containing the Yugoslav capacity to launch their attacks on civilians, and if they insist on continuing with those attacks, then on degrading their ability to carry on with them. But beyond that, there is a broader diplomatic and political objective, which is to bring the President to the negotiating table.
John,
and when and if that happens, of course, the calculation is thrown more
John,
widely.
thanks very much indeed. We're going over to Ben Brown in Pristina, where the bombing has started. Ben, what have you heard and what can you tell us?
Well, all I can tell you, Martyn, is that I've heard 3 or 4 extremely large explosions and several bursts of fire, which could be anti-aircraft fire. It's very difficult to tell from this vantage point. I'm in the centre of Pristina, the capital. I've just seen 2 truckloads of armed troops rolling through the streets of Pristina, but otherwise the streets are very, very deserted. There's hardly anybody out and about.
And Ben, any noise of warplanes accompanying these bombs? In other words, can you tell whether those explosions were caused by B-52s dropping cruise missiles, or in fact whether you had the fighters that have taken off from the NATO airbase in northeastern Italy taking part?
No, it's very difficult, I'm afraid, for us to tell. Movement around the city is very difficult. It's extremely tense. And there have been many threats against foreign journalists here, so it's very difficult to move around. But we've heard air raid sirens in the last few minutes. There had been test air raid sirens earlier in the day, but I think the one we just heard was for real. And then several large explosions, as I say, but difficult to know exactly where they were. There are strategic military installations around the city, and it may well be that those have been hit.
Ben, thanks very much indeed. We will, of course, come back to you if there's any more bombing. We're going now to Mark Laity in Brussels. Mark, what more can you tell us about that statement from the NATO Secretary-General, Javier Solana, confirming that the bombing had taken place?
Yes, hello.
Mark, what more
hello,
can you
this
tell
is Mark Laity in NATO headquarters. I have here the statement which has just been issued by Javier Solana, the NATO Secretary-General. It says, "I have been informed by Sackur, General Clark, that at this moment NATO air operation against targets in the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia have commenced." So there's the official confirmation of the explosions that we've been seeing. So air operations have started. We know that cruise missiles are the spearhead, but over the days and nights that follow, those operations will have a much higher tempo. Now, I'm just joined, in fact, by the spokesman for the Secretary General, the NATO spokesman, Jamie Shea. Jamie, this is the confirmation.
Indeed.
Where is this all going to lead? How long are we going to expect to see attacks?
Well, obviously we hope this evening to have a very effective series of strikes to show to President Milosevic that this is a very serious operation. Whatever he has thought about this, he has to know that the international community is very serious in its determination to stop his aggression in Kosovo. And as you would expect, we have a very carefully planned operation that will be lasting throughout the night. Obviously, as for the next few days, we'll have to wait and see. We hope to, by showing President Milosevic that we're serious, to induce him to agree sooner rather than later to meet the demands of the international community.
Are we looking at a cruise missile attack? Is it going to be much bigger than that? How quickly are we going to see the manned aircraft coming in to add to the operations intensity?
Well, the most important thing on this first night, of course, is to downgrade, to degrade the air defense system of Yugoslavia, so that very quickly we are in a situation where we have air supremacy and therefore our pilots are able to operate in a safe environment. So that clearly is going to be the focus of tonight, but I would remind you that NATO's plans also allow us to attack very early on military units in Kosovo which are carrying out attacks against the civilian population.
Jamie Shea, thank you very much. And now back to the studio.
Mark, thank you. And Tony Lloyd, Foreign Office Minister, is in our Westminster studio. Mr. Lloyd, can you tell us if any British troops or pilots are involved in this initial phase of the operations?
I'm not in a position to confirm that. What is the case is that Britain is ready to take a full part in all activities, obviously even including at this very early stage. But I think the significance of this now is that Milosevic has chosen to run out of time. What NATO is undertaking on our behalf, of course, is extremely serious. It's serious for our own service personnel. It's serious for all the people of Yugoslavia, both Albanian and Serb. And Milosevic, actually even now, has to get back to the negotiating table.
And how long do you anticipate the first phase of raids going on before he is driven back to diplomacy?
Well, I don't think it's us who should be saying how long this will take. It's Milosevic now who has to concentrate his own mind and realise that the threat he faces is of such serious proportions that we will, as the spokesman for NATO has said, we will degrade his ability to make war on his own people. We are determined to prevent the humanitarian crisis being allowed to increase, and in fact being deliberately increased by Milosevic's actions. So now he knows this is serious. It's not a bluff. It's about human life. Milosevic is the one who has to resolve to get back to the peace conference to come back to negotiate.
President Milosevic, in fact, said this afternoon when he was talking to the Serbian people that they wanted to defend the country with all the means possible, but he also said, we are committed to continuing the political process with all the persistence possible. Now, that might indicate that even though the raids are imminent, and perhaps even now they started to take place, that the door is still open. What kind of diplomacy can take place under these very difficult circumstances? Well,
I've got to make it very clear that, of course, Milosevic's role in the negotiating process so far is to make agreements which is subsequently broken, to commit himself, for example, to a ceasefire last October, which he systematically failed to honour, to agree to limit the amount of his own troops in Kosovo to levels half what he now has. So if Milosevic is coming back seriously to negotiate, he has to do it on a very different basis, and his credibility will be seriously tested. That said, we want negotiation, we want a political solution. We want him to commit himself, not to wage war on his own people, not to provoke a humanitarian crisis in Kosovo. But the onus is on him to demonstrate that that's done, perhaps not in good faith, but with testable and transparency that we will put to the test.
Mr. Lloyd, thank you very much indeed. President Clinton is about to speak to the American people. Over to Stephen Sackur in Washington. Stephen, what's the reaction in Washington to the news of the raids have taken place?
No surprise, Martin. We've been waiting for this all day. As you say, President Clinton is about to give a statement to address the nation. We're expecting that any minute now. He will tell Americans why he believes it is in the U.S. national interest to be involved in NATO's military action in Kosovo. And I think he is trying to persuade the American people that this military action is worth spilling American blood for. That's his main political challenge at the moment.
And can you give me any indication of what the appetite in America is for this? Because President Clinton only yesterday was making a very, very powerful speech to the American people, actually explaining what Kosovo was all about. How did that go down? What's the reaction to that? Has he managed to convince them?
The reaction has been mixed, and it's been very interesting. A week ago, when opinion polls were taken on this issue, most Americans were against US military involvement in Yugoslavia. Today, the polls suggest that the public is deeply and evenly split about whether US forces should be involved. So it looks as though the president's hammering home of this message that this is, number one, a humanitarian crisis, but number two, a crisis which involves crucial US national interests. That message is getting home, but still there are many Americans, and indeed many American politicians in the Republican Party, who say that the president's policy is ill thought out, it's misguided, and that the president has no idea how he's going to get out of the potential mess that Yugoslavia policy might become. So there are real reservations, but at the moment, most Americans are prepared to give the president, I think, the benefit of the doubt.
Stephen, thanks very much indeed. And just for those of you tuning in to see Holiday on a Shoestring, I can tell you that it will be shown at a later date, and this program will continue until 7:30, bringing you the latest news about the NATO strikes against Yugoslavia, which have just begun. At 7 o'clock this evening, the NATO Secretary General Javier Solana confirmed that the offensive had started. We must stop the violence and bring an end to the humanitarian catastrophe now taking place in Kosovo, he said. His announcement came a few minutes after reports that fighter planes had taken off from bases in southern Italy. American bombers carrying cruise missiles left Britain in mid-morning. There have already been reports of explosions and gunfire both in Belgrade and the Kosovan capital Pristina. Air raid sirens are sounding in Belgrade. President Clinton and Tony Blair, who is in Berlin for the European summit, are expected to speak within the next few minutes. And the Foreign Office Minister Tony Lloyd has just told us that he hoped the strikes would drive the Yugoslav president, Slobodan Milosevic, back to the negotiating table. Now, we are in a live program bringing you the latest, and we are going the latest on the bombing, and that bombing was confirmed first of all by the Dutch foreign minister, then by other foreign ministers, and then finally by Javier Solana, the NATO Secretary General. This is how he put it.
I have been informed by Sackur, General Clark, that at this moment NATO air operations against targets in the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia have started. In the last month, the international community has spared no effort to achieve a negotiated solution in Kosovo, but it has not been possible. Clear responsibility for the air strikes lies with President Milosevic, who has refused to stop his violent action.
And we're now going live to America, where President Clinton is appearing on American television, talking about Kosovo.
Has again chosen aggression over peace. The commitments he himself made last fall to stop the brutal repression in Kosovo. He has rejected the balanced and fair peace accords that our allies and partners, including Russia, proposed last month, a peace agreement that Kosovo's ethnic Albanians courageously accepted. Instead, his forces have intensified their attacks, burning down Kosovar Albanian villages and murdering civilians. As I speak, more Serb forces are moving into Kosovo, and more people are fleeing their homes. 60,000 in just the last 5 weeks. 250,000 altogether. Many have headed toward neighboring countries. Kosovo's crisis now is full-blown, and if we do not act, clearly it will get even worse. Only firmness now can prevent greater catastrophe later. Our strikes have 3 objectives. First, to demonstrate the seriousness of NATO's opposition to aggression and its support for peace. Second, to deter President Milosevic from continuing and escalating his attacks on helpless civilians by imposing a price for those attacks. And third, if necessary, to damage Serbia's capacity to wage war against Kosovo in the future by seriously diminishing its military capabilities. As I have repeatedly said to the American people, this act is not risk-free. It carries risks. And I ask for the prayers of all Americans for our men and women in uniform in the area. However, I have concluded that the dangers of acting now are clearly outweighed by the risks of failing to act. The risks that many more innocent people will die or be driven from their homes by the tens of thousands. The risks that the conflict will involve and destabilize neighboring nations. It will clearly be much more costly and dangerous to stop later than this effort to prevent it from going further now. At the end of the 20th century, after 2 world wars and a Cold War, we and our allies have a chance to leave our children a Europe that is free, peaceful, and stable. But we must act now to do that. Because if the Balkans once again become a place of brutal killing and massive refugee flights, it will be impossible to achieve. With our allies, we use diplomacy and force to end the war in Bosnia. Now trouble next door in Kosovo puts the region's people at risks again. Our NATO allies unanimously support this action. The United States must stand with them and stand against ethnic violence and atrocity. Our alliance is united, and I am particularly grateful for the support we have received from members of Congress from both parties. As we go forward, I will remain in close contact with Congress. I have spoken with all the leaders today and in contact with our friends and allies around the world. And I will have more to say about all of this tonight. Thank you.
Mr. President, what do you ask of Milosevic?
President Clinton taking no questions there, saying he will have more to say later, and telling the American people, confirming to the American people that the bombing of Serbia by NATO forces has begun. John Simpson is in the Serbian capital, Belgrade. John, I gather you have actually been watching the missiles land.
Yes, a short time ago we heard sirens, but they were a little late because by that stage, well, I myself had already seen 2 missiles presumably hitting their targets, not close to the city. There was a flash in the sky on both occasions. It was too far away to hear the sound, so presumably it must have been about 15 or 20 miles away in each case. A big column of smoke you can still see on the horizon, or at least you could for some time after the first impact. We're just really waiting for others. I assume that they've been directed towards air installations, which we know are in that area just on the outskirts of the city of Belgrade.
Yes, John, so the target, first of all, would be the air defences attacked by cruise missiles before the fighters moved in.
That's right. There's one big airbase, the biggest airbase, in fact, in Serbia, which is about 15 or 20 miles out from the center of the city, and that seemed to me to be a natural target. When I saw it the other day, there were planes in hangars on the runway. It just seems a natural thing for NATO to strike at early on, and it's in that direction. I assume that's what the target was.
John, thanks very much indeed. We will, of course, come back to you if there are any more developments. The Liberal Democrat leader, Paddy Ashdown, is in our Westminster studio now. Mr. Ashdown, you would have heard President Clinton speak just a moment ago about this operation carrying risks. Presumably, as far as you are concerned, those risks are acceptable because of the enormity of the task in hand.
I would not wish us to take any risks, but you cannot get yourself through this situation without being prepared to do so, and the risk of not taking this action would be immeasurably greater, as President Clinton quite rightly made clear. We had no option. I mean, the Serbs continued with their brutalization, ethnic cleansing, close to genocide of the Albanian population. They were in flagrant abuse of the UN Security Council resolution and the laws of international law, and we had to act at this time. There wasn't an alternative. It's very grim, but that's the reality.
At some point, of course, President Milosevic comes back to the negotiating table. How far down the line do you hope that will be?
I hope it's tomorrow, but I don't anticipate it. I think it'll take some time, and we must be prepared to see this through with a degree of determination. I mean, I wish there had been an alternative. NATO went every last mile to achieve peace. But if we'd allowed the flagrant abuse of international law and the flouting of the Security Council resolutions to continue, the whole structure of international law would itself have been in danger, and we would have inevitably seen not only catastrophic sights on our television screens of bloodshed and brutality far worse than we have seen so far, but we would also see a widening Balkan war with immense consequences to the whole security of Europe. We have to be very grim about this tonight, but there was no alternative to do what we have done. And I think we must now wait till the military commanders have done the job we've set for them. And our thoughts tonight ought to be with those and their families who are going into action.
Mr. Ashdown, thank you for joining us. And in the studio we have Jonathan Isle from the Royal United Services Institute. Has NATO got its tactics right here, Mr. Isle?
Well, certainly for the moment, it seems to. I mean, the most interesting development in the last few minutes is that actually the first strikes were in Pristina, the capital of Kosovo. The original assumption was that NATO will strike in other parts of Yugoslavia in order to dismantle the air defenses, but will not touch the Yugoslav forces that are conducting the offensive on the ground.
But is there not some sense in going for the Serb forces conducting the offensive, because they are spearheading the reason why the whole operation is taking place in the first place?
Indeed, absolutely. But the political message is very potent. What we're actually saying to them is, while we dismantle their air defenses in order to allow NATO aircraft freedom of movement, we will also not lose sight of what is going on the ground, and that is the key. The main question is, however, whether it would be possible to translate a military operation, which clearly is well executed, into a political advantage. What is ultimately the aim? I fully predict that President Milosevic of Yugoslavia will adopt the hedgehog approach. He would basically sit tight and wait to see how far we are prepared to go. So we really are looking at some escalation in the NATO offensive over the next few days.
Well, thank you very much. David Shukman is in Berlin at the summit, at the EU summit. David, what news from there, where all the prime ministers are gathered?
Well, indeed, Tony Blair, the Prime Minister, in the last few minutes has been speaking to reporters. He described the action being taken tonight as very much the right thing to do. He addressed the concerns of the families of the service people involved, saying naturally they would feel anxiety, but could also feel some pride at the action being taken tonight. There is obviously unease and concern within NATO governments about the risk of Allied pilots being shot down over Serbia during this operation, and clearly the leaders here, and indeed President Clinton, want to prepare public opinion for that eventuality. Mr. Blair went on to say that Kosovo is on Europe's doorstep, and that the effects of the crisis there would indeed be felt throughout Europe. There's a feeling very acutely here as the EU gathers to discuss its own budgetary problems, its own problems with the European Commission, that the real crisis is not all that far away to the east, down in the Balkans, and unless the EU addresses this crisis, the problem will spread throughout Europe.
And David, I hope you can hear me over the siren, but you talk
Indeed.
about... You can, good. Are
Well,
you sure you
I
can? It's extremely loud at this end.
Indeed,
it's
the
this end. So
sirens are
David,
very loud.
David, thank you for the moment. We're going to Tom Carver, who is in Washington. Tom, the latest from Washington, the reaction perhaps to President Clinton's address a few minutes ago to the American people.
Well, as you say, it was only a few minutes ago, so I think a lot of Americans are going to be waiting to hear what President Clinton says in greater detail tonight. He has said he will address the nation on national television, and that, I think, will be the moment when most people will be back at home, when this crisis, what is happening in Kosovo, will begin to seep into the American consciousness. At the moment, Kosovo, really, most Americans wouldn't be able to find it on the map, to be quite honest, and until the bombing starts and until they see the consequence of that bombing, I think most Americans are not going to absorb the true gravity of this. But President Clinton has laid out his plan, and I think what was very interesting from the brief remarks he said is that it's clearly going to be a two-stage process. They are going to go and try and degrade President Milosevic's ability to commit genocide inside Kosovo, and then if he shows no sign of letting up, then they will go on to degrade his military capability overall right across Serbia, and Yugoslavia.
Tom,
so
thank you.
That is a warning to President Milosevic that they mean business and that they will go on for several days.
Tom, thank you very much indeed. The Conservative leader, William Hague, is in our Westminster studio now. We're running out of time, Mr. Hague, but very quickly, your reaction to what has happened tonight.
Well, let's hope that Milosevic sees sense. We've got a humanitarian disaster going on in Kosovo. Let's hope this brings him to his senses, because nothing else has so far. And of course, our thoughts have got to be with the servicemen and women who may have to go into action, with their families, with the people who have to back them up back at their bases. There are a huge number of people involved in this, and I think our primary thoughts are with them. But let's hope it makes him see sense.
Mr. Hague, thank you very much for joining us. And we have just heard that 2 of the B-52s that took off from RAF there for this morning have returned after the attacks. The attacks, which in fact started half an hour ago. And BBC correspondents in Belgrade and the Kosovan capital Pristina have already reported hearing explosions. The Prime Minister, in a statement a few minutes ago, said the action was being taken for one reason only: to damage Serb forces sufficiently to stop President Milosevic from carrying out what he called the vile oppression of Albanians in Kosovo. We will of course keep you fully informed throughout the evening and next on the 9 o'clock news. But for now, good night.
This is BBC One. Because of the extended news report, we're sorry we're unable to bring you holidays on a shoestring, but it will be back next week. Now, tomorrow's world.
Tonight, modernise.